Welcome to Unit 4 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In this video, we'll focus on the teaching aspect of pronunciation. In this video, we'll look at helping students set realistic goals and also addressing some of the challenges of teaching pronunciation. And we'll also talk about lesson types that can be used to present pronunciation to students. As we mentioned before, pronunciation is one of 4 language systems, including grammar, vocabulary, and culture. It's important that teachers understand how to explain these systems so that they can teach them to their students. There are many aspects of pronunciation, just as with all language skills. Pronunciation is a cognitive skill, which means we have to understand what's happening with the mouth and the parts of the mouth to create sounds. It's psychomotor, which means we need to feel comfortable with the muscle control of moving our mouth in perhaps ways that are unfamiliar with our native language. And it's also an affective skill, which means that we may have a barrier, an emotional kind of barrier that's preventing us from being open to viewing ourselves as a speaker of this language and wanting to experiment and try to become a speaker of that language. Let's talk about goals for language learners. Many language learners, when it comes to pronunciation, think that being native-like and having a native-like accent is the ultimate goal. In reality, this is a very problematic goal. First, the idea of what is a native speaker of English is almost impossible to determine because there is no one form of English that is spoken by native speakers. It's a very democratic language that is spoken across the world, and each region has its own variation of English and its own accent of English, which means that there is no real true perfect English accent. Instead, what we should do is help learners focus on making intelligibility their goal. The idea of intelligibility means that our accent can be clearly understood by other speakers of English, whether they be native speakers or non-native speakers of English. All of us, including native speakers of English, need to have an intelligible accent so that they can communicate and be understood by the widest variety of English users. Some of the challenges that all learners face when they learn a new language are these 4 categories of maybe errors or problems. The first is called merging. Merging happens when in the target language there are 2 sounds that the learner cannot distinguish. And as a result, those 2 sounds become one sound, and the learner uses the same sound for both of them. Sometimes this happens with users who may not have an R or an L sound in their language. And so when they hear R and L in English, they just use a different sound to represent both of them, or they use only one sound to represent both of them. And this can lead to intelligibility problems. Substitution is very similar, but substitution happens when the target language has a sound that the learner does not have in their native language. And so the learner uses a sound from their native language instead of the sound from the target language. This happened to me for years as a French speaker. There is a French vowel that we do not have in English, the U sound, and I would always just use the long U, the OO sound. But those are distinct sounds in French, and I just was using the OO sound for both of them. And so my intelligibility in French was limited because of my inability to understand and use the target sound. Fossilization is a common problem across all language learners in many areas, including pronunciation. And fossilization is the idea that the learner may develop maybe a bad habit, so to speak. The idea that they're using the pronunciation of the language in a way that may be interfering with communication. But because they've used this habit for so long, it could be very difficult to change. And that's why we call it a fossilization. It's hard to change something that's become part of their habit system. So we want to address errors or problems that are interfering with intelligibility quickly on before they become fossilized. Hypercorrection is not as common as fossilization, but it can interfere with intelligibility. What happens with hypercorrection is when a learner learns an exception to a rule. And so then they start applying this exception everywhere. This could happen in English, for instance, when someone learns that in General American English, a T sound can become a short D sound. We call it a flap sometimes when it's on an unstressed syllable between vowel sounds. For example, we would use it in General American English when we say the word butter. We use almost a D sound there instead of a T, like butter. And so a learner may think, oh, that's the sound for T in English is this flap sound, and they start using the flap sound everywhere. And it's only in some very specialized situations where we would use that sound. So we want to make sure that learners are aware of exceptions to common patterns in English, but they don't apply that exception widely beyond its intended context. As we think about how to present pronunciation to our students, there are different approaches that teachers may take. One of them is to write a full lesson. And the idea here is that we would take an entire class period to teach an aspect of pronunciation that we felt was important for our students to learn. So a complete lesson, and this is especially helpful and useful when all learners have the same pronunciation need. We can identify they're all struggling with this aspect of pronunciation, so it's worth it to spend the time to address it. The only problem is that most teachers don't feel like they have enough time to devote to pronunciation, let alone an entire lesson to pronunciation, or that all students would need that pronunciation instruction. But if you have the time, it's great to be able to do that. Some teachers, because they don't have that much time, they'll just do a small lesson. So they'll do a mini lesson, it's part of maybe a bigger lesson that explains the pronunciation feature that they feel like students should learn. But because they don't have a full lesson to devote to it, students will need to practice and monitor on their own outside of class time. Now, many teachers will opt for an integrated lesson, and this is actually what most researchers will recommend. The idea of an integrated lesson is that pronunciation instruction is taught with another skill. So maybe we're having a lesson on spelling or reading or speaking, and we teach pronunciation. Oh, by the way, this is a pronunciation feature that relates to what we're doing right now. The reason why this is preferred is that it makes pronunciation contextualized in meaningful tasks that the students are already doing. So they're more likely to remember and apply and evaluate their ability to follow that pronunciation feature. Now, a more advanced teacher may opt for incidental lessons. The idea here is that these are unplanned lessons. Instead, the teacher knows a lot about pronunciation and about how to teach it, and waits for a moment in the classroom where the student maybe makes an error or has a question where pronunciation can address that concern or issue. And so they just present it then, right in time for the student, and this is likely to help the student really remember the information and be able to apply it. But of course it's challenging because it requires lots of experience and knowledge about pronunciation and being ready to teach on the spot. But it has the highest impact usually for learners to be able to apply and remember that pronunciation feature. So in this video we've talked about setting realistic goals for pronunciation, about some of the challenges and barriers students face as they learn pronunciation, and we've talked about different ways teachers could design lessons in order to teach their students about English pronunciation.